So it's our great pleasure to welcome Seinenu Thein-Lemelson today for this seminar for all of those of you in the room, but also for people who are online and watching this. It's our real pleasure. We've known Joe and I've known Seinenu for a number of years now and know about this remarkable project she's been working on with the democracy movement in Myanmar from a time really since 2013. She's been working on this project. She's been interviewing the activists who were in prison, then who were out of prison for a period of time, was hoping to write a book during the time that they would all be out of prison. And many of them are back in prison these days. And she'll be telling us about that movement today. Just a few words. Seinenu actually did her degree, not in anthropology, though we consider her a psychological anthropologist, but in developmental psychology at UCLA, did her PhD there, then is now teaches courses at UCLA and having to do many of them with issues of imprisonment, and actually some quite large courses that are of interest to many people who are not only people interested in Southeast Asia and in Myanmar, but more generally about issues of imprisonment, confinement, and social activism at UCLA. So it's a great pleasure to welcome her today and to really give us all a chance to catch up on what you've been doing, but also on current issues of Myanmar. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Byron, and also Mary Jo, and also Michael Fisher for hosting me and for inviting me. Really, I think the two of you, Byron and Mary Jo, have been so supportive of this project and this fieldwork experience. Even when initially in 2013, I didn't know that it was fieldwork for me, and I can talk a little bit more about that. That it was something that I had done my dissertation on something completely different at UCLA on childhood socialization. And then I encountered these democracy activists, and I remember as early as 2015, 2016, Mary Jo and I, and with a few other anthropologists, did a very small seminar at the AAAs, and encouraging then and a lot at different iterations of this project. You've just been so incredibly supportive. So now that I'm hopefully finally finishing the book, and it's sort of at least there'll be something that I'll be able to share with the community, with the scholarly community, but also the community of dissidents there. Although, it's a much more tragic set of circumstances than it was in 2013 when it was more hopeful. So, the theme of the talk today is political self-sacrifice in Myanmar on the technologies of charisma and well-being. And one of the first things that I actually want to do is actually memorialize and also remember all the individuals that were actually part of my field work who are no longer with us. So when I started my field work in 2013, and this is not all the individuals that I've lost who were part of my field work. These were just the people that I would say that are my friends that I saw every day when I would go to Burma, when I would go to the 88 Generation office, and hang out with these former political prisoners and dissidents. And I will reference many of them throughout my talk, but I want you to know their names: Sanzatwe, Go Jimmy, Go Baum Baum, Mut Mimi, Go Iti, and Mut Noble A. And at least three of them we lost after the coup. After the 2021 military coup, all three of them tortured and executed by the military. Mut Noble A, for example, she was someone who had been a long-term political prisoner in Burma, and she had already served over 10 years in prison. Likewise with Gojimi. Gojimi had just served over 2 decades in prison. And then when the 2021 coup occurred, they all began to protest again, to resist against the junta. Venerable A was actually diagnosed with cancer before for a period of time as she went into Thailand after the coup for some treatment. And then there was one point where she decided to go back into the country. And then that's when they caught her. They imprisoned her first. And then when the first day that they took her out to court, they brought her, as they were driving her back from court, they executed her. And we never got the body. We never knew about it until a week after, at least a week after she had been executed. We don't know where she was buried. And as one of the dissidents wrote to me, we don't know if they shot her in the head or shot her in the heart or in the back. Likewise with Gojimi, who's actually a very well-known figure in the democracy movement. Each one of these individuals also had a different personal history and a positionality in the movement. Gojimi, for example, is a very well-known, internationally known leader in the democracy movement in Myanmar. And he was also executed by the junta. This made the New York Times. This is a much more well-known narrative. But there are many more individuals like Go Iti, who was just more recently executed by the junta in Mandalay region. So I do want to reference my friends in the democracy movement. Those were the memories that what you saw before was the memories I had of them, the happy memories I had of them. This is the images that show up in the media after they're executed. The images that the junta circulates, the decontextualized images of them in these blue uniforms, their faces floating in a disembodied space online. And that's what's released to the press. And as we'll talk about, even some of the human rights representations that are meant to infuse the bodily suffering of these individuals with a certain humanity. Much of it is also, I would say, decontextualized, dehistoricized, and depoliticized to a certain extent. This is Gojimi, his image a year after I believe he was executed. There was an image of him projected against the wall of the exterior of the British House of Parliament, and it says, "Remember Jimmy, remember Myanmar." This is actually a photo that was taken right after he was released, but that's not actually his hand, and he wouldn't have necessarily made this gesture. It's this kind of disembodied hand for the new movement that started after 2021 that Jimmy somewhat participated in, but really did really encapsulate who he was about. And we'll talk more about that as well. So this representation is also disembodied, decontextualized image of them. So I'll tell you more about them because it's now been 3 years since the military coup in Myanmar. And I always tell people, in order to really understand the military coup in Burma, you have to certainly reach back into history. We can reach back quite far, actually. I'm only going to reach back until the 2015 election to give you some context, and then we'll reach even further back as we go along. This was during the period of my field work, and it was certainly a joyous time. It was a joyous time because it was the first free and fair elections that they had in many decades. And the resistance, what's typically called the opposition to the Burmese military, the National League for Democracy, won a landslide victory against the military-backed ruling party. And this was really when everyone was celebrating on the streets. There was just absolute elation on the part of the bystanders. And just to give you a sense of some of the crowds that will be drawn during this movement. I was there during this time. And so this is one of the pictures of one of the NLD rallies that happened in Yangon at the time. And if you see, that's the stage, and everything else in that word are the spectators who showed up. really remarkable amount of support that they had. So just to give you some background on the Burmese democracy movement or the nonviolent struggle for democracy movement in Burma, it began in 1988. It began with university students in Yangon, and many of these democracy activists. Go Jimmy was one of them. For them, the NLD winning these elections was really something that they had worked towards their entire adult lives. They had been imprisoned, they had lost friends and family, they were subjected to political violence, torture, harassment, dehumanization. And 1988 was sort of like the Burmese Arab Spring. Some of you may remember it, some of the younger folks may have heard about it. These are nationwide protests where millions of demonstrators came out onto the streets. The military committed massacres in Yangon and other parts of Burma during this time. And we don't have any good figures for 1988, the number of people killed, upwards of 10,000. I think that's a very low estimate. Most of the bodies were taken out of the city center and cremated. And in the aftermath of these massacres, there was the prohibition of public meetings. So no more than 5 could gather at a time. There was complete and total censorship, especially as it pertained, by the way, as we'll talk about, to sort of photographic depictions or any textual record of the democracy movement itself. So if you had a photo of Aung San Suu Kyi, or you had a photo of Go Jimmy or Min Ko Dan or any one of these political prisoners, you could risk going to prison yourself, or at least be interrogated by the authorities. There's a household registry, so no freedom of movement, a vast surveillance network in the local neighborhoods with informers and military intelligence. The universities where the democracy movement started, because it started largely with university students in the urban centers. The universities would be closed for years at a time. There was the manipulation of cultural narratives, forced labor in both the urban and rural areas. And there was the annulment of other democratic elections in 1990. At that time, over 400 elected members of parliament were systematically rounded up, interrogated, they were tortured, and given lengthy prison sentences. My uncle, who was elected into parliament at the time, was one of these individuals. NLD offices were raided and shut down. There was forced labor, land seizures, property confiscations, typically directed at communities of dissidents or communities, whole constituencies who voted for the NLD. Entire neighborhoods in Burma were burned to the ground and the people forcefully relocated. So this is not happening in Rakhine State with the Rohingya communities. This is happening right in the former capital of Yangon to diverse people based entirely on their political allegiance to the National League for Democracy. And I think there's no good figures, but I would say over the years, upwards of 100,000 imprisoned as political prisoners. Inside the prisons, the political prisoners were denied adequate food, clean water, sanitation, medical care. They were used as forced labor. They were tortured and dehumanized. Some of the dissidents I worked with told me stories about how they would be kept in cells meant for military dogs for months at a time. They were forced to wear chains around their feet for months at a time. Women prisoners were forced to appear in court with sarongs that were still stained with their menstrual blood in order to humiliate them in front of others. And an unknown number perished from the violence, disease, and inhumane conditions in the prisons. So one of the main questions I ask in my research is really, in the face of 27 years of state-sponsored oppression, persecution, violence, and domination, how do you really draw crowds like this? This was one of the questions that I began with. How do social movements remain resilient across time? And how do these individuals, the activists and political prisoners who participate in these movements, remain resilient across time? And this is part of a broader research agenda. It's certainly an attempt on my part. Prior to, if you look at the literature on Burma,
I think since the 2021 coup, it's all about resistance. But actually prior to 2021, there was almost nothing on resistance in Burma. It was all about the military and military history, which we'll talk about. But what little there was, largely looked at this nonviolent struggle for democracy according to these four broad transnational discourses. That was human rights, humanitarianism or humanitarian aid, the public health model of trauma, even that really didn't come into play until after about 2013, 2010, 2013, and other sort of neoliberal frameworks, broadly construed. And in terms of popular representations of the democracy movement and its community of political prisoners, that is also something that really vacillated between extreme representations, depicting some of the well-known leaders, particularly Aung San Suu Kyi, as either noble or savage, as being either victims or perpetrators, as being courageous or cowardly, as human rights heroes or human rights villains, or saints, versus being a pariah or a monster. And as I remarked previously, certainly the academic history of Burma, from that depicts contemporary Burmese history from 1962 to 2015. As I said, after 2021, it's been all about resistance, but prior to 2021, it was largely studies of Burma, histories of Burma, was largely a history and a narrative of the military and its many conflicts. There was an emphasis on the subjectivity of military actors, their motivations, their historical agency, their sense of power, control, dominance, and their psychocultural qualities. There's quite a lot even written in the New York Times and other more more widely disseminated textual information is largely focused on the military. So this is part of a broader attempt on my part to shift focus away from the from a focus on the historical agency and subjectivity of the military, move away from relying solely on these transnational frameworks, and really center my analysis on the culture, psychology, and subjectivity of the political prisoners themselves, and also their supporters. And of course, I'm employing methods and theoretical approaches of psychological and medical anthropology. So the unit of analysis is personal experiences, especially at the level of emotion and at the level of sort of embodied experiences. So this is based on more than 10 years. I have to update this slide. It's going on 13 years now. Of a multi-site ethnography with the former political prisoner community in Burma and also in the Burmese diaspora. And it continues to this day. And, I conducted ethnographic and person-centered interviews with well over 100 political prisoners, their families, supporters. The number is much larger. I just haven't updated this slide. And I would hang out with them, as you'll see, in very private and personal settings. I would accompany them on medical appointments or the hospital visits when they would undergo cancer or chemotherapy. I'd show up for all their festivals, for their weddings, religious ceremonies, funerals, organizational meetings that they would have where they would organize rallies, and just participated in the community. As I said, I reference these individuals as my friends. And I also collected a fair amount of visual and audio data on them. But more than anything during this period and to this day, I try to make an existential commitment to this community and to my friends in this community. So just to give you a broad overview of the social movement community of the democracy movement. The social movement community of the democracy movement is not bounded by territory. You can find them in the diaspora. You can find them in IDP camps. You can find them in small villages. You can find them in the urban centers in Yangon, where the student movement and the democracy movement eventually began. I think the core, I haven't done a survey. I think the core community in terms of all the folks and everyone that all the other people that they're connected to and that offers them support, their family, their friends, their large networks, both in Burma and in the diaspora is probably upwards of 100,000. In terms of the community that I spent my time with during my fieldwork, it was around 3,000 to 5,000 community members who had continuous face-to-face and physical contact with one another. And this community inside of Burma is connected to the diaspora through social media and other internet technologies. And the social movement community of the democracy movement is also ethnically, religiously, ideologically, and socioeconomically diverse. So they consisted of Burmese, Chin, Gayin, Kachin. There were many of South Asian descent. There were Rohingya, Shan, Chinese, Mun, Myaik, Rakhine. This is not an exhaustive list. Many were of mixed heritage. Likewise, there were Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, those who were really into the Nat and spirit cult, as we'll talk a little bit about as well. The vast majority of individuals that I tended to hang out with were secular. They were usually secular artists and intellectuals. And they ran the gambit. They ran the gambit in terms ideologically as well. So there were many with very strong Marxist leanings, but many also embraced wholly, partially or in symbolic ways, neoliberal economic principles. This is Zia Thaw, who was actually executed alongside Go Jimmy over a year ago. And he very much symbolized for neoliberal economic principles. Often he was one of the first hip hop rap artists in Burma, actually, one very close to Aung San Suu Kyi, one of her main, the main folks in parliament that she worked with. And in terms of socioeconomic status, they were also relatively former political prisoners and activists from this community, had relatively high levels of education. There were doctors and attorneys, but there are also individuals who were shopkeepers or taxi drivers or farmers. They hailed from both urban and rural areas. As I said, many creative intellectuals were at the center of the movement. There were artists and novelists, poets. However way they got their start, many descended into poverty after decades of political imprisonment, and so did their families. And there was intermarriage between the activists across all these sort of constructed categories that we care about as social scientists. So one of the questions that I had to ask when I began this research as well was, really, given this great diversity in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religion, that they weren't bounded in a geographical space, what really does bind them together? And really what binds them together is shared suffering and a shared meaning system about the nature of that suffering. And one of the main foundational moral and relational concepts that was most meaningful to this community was the concept of anitna, or sacrifice in Burmese. And really, anitna is this sort of lay, colloquial, locally meaningful, indigenous concept. Mel Spiro would have references at sort of the fulcrum upon which the very complex ritual, material, political, moral life of the democracy activists rested. It's very much based, as I'll talk about, on Theravadan Buddhist ethics, but for Burma, because it's a colloquial term, because it's a lay term, it's a familiar term to everyone used in the everyday. For Burmese speakers, the use of the term transcended any particular religious tradition. Everyone would use it, and it has extremely profound motivational salience for the activists and supporters in the Burmese democracy movement. And it's really the valorization of sacrifice that places the political prisoner at the center of this community. And I'll actually be using the colloquial term that they reference, how they reference themselves, so they don't necessarily use, there's a formal term in Burmese, Nagaye Ijindar, Nagaye Ijindu, to reference former political prisoner, but they simply use the colloquial term Nainjin to reference themselves, and that's the term that I'll use from now on. And really the Nainjin were the center of the movement, precisely because they had been politically imprisoned, because they had moved through the liminality and violence of the interrogation centers and the prisons. And for them, after moving through this horrific torture and violence in the prisons and in the interrogation centers, they didn't necessarily consider themselves, as we would, to have been afflicted to have been traumatized. They considered themselves, because it was about sacrifice, they considered themselves to have been made pure and demonstrated the purity of their intent, of their intentions, and their commitment to the movement. And Anitna is derived from Buddhist notions of selflessness, certainly the doctrine of anatta. And Anitna is also very much connected to the larger Buddhist discourse on giving and generosity, or dana. And two forms of sacrificial giving that exist within the Buddhist canon is the more sort of ordinary forms of sacrifice. You're talking about, this is the ordinary forms of sacrifice are those that everyone can engage in. This is the type of donations that you do when you donate food to a monk, when he comes for alms, donating in terms of giving incense or monastic robes to the bhikkhu. And it also, I would also say that there's also many forms of ordinary sacrifice that take place within the family that are of more of a relational nature. And then there's the extraordinary forms of sacrifice. And these are usually enacted and practiced by bodhisattvas or future Buddhas. And there are many tales of these types of sacrifices. The most exalted form of giving in the Buddhist tradition is the bodily sacrifice, or what's known as gifts of the body. And there's many stories in the Jataka about the future Buddha in various forms, either as a king, taking out his eyes and giving it to those who need it, or as for example, this is a story that's told quite a lot to children, as the Monkey King, sacrificing his body, actually having a presiding over thousands of other monkeys who actually need to get to the other side of a forest in order to escape the humans who are trying to harm them, and he forms a bridge, and he allows over 10,000 monkeys to cross over his body. His back breaks in the end, and then he falls to his death. So these are the types of sacrificial giving that's valorized and that children grow up with in Burma. And then Nitna as a concept is simultaneously sort of active and passive. So it's in the passive voice because the person who Anitna kan is enduring suffering and loss as a sacrificial victim, but this person is also actively sort of freely and knowingly choosing to sacrifice. So the person who engages in Anitna is both subject and object, the agent who is acting sacrificially, as well as the thing that's being sacrificed. And also another sort of qualities of Anitna is that in terms of the political form of self-sacrifice, these extraordinary forms of self-sacrifice, it really tied, the sacrifice of one generation tied and bound them to other generations. So it tied multiple generations of actual and fictive kin together. And it was this sort of seemingly unending cycle of Anitna. This intergenerational connection infused the Nanjin with a sense of meaning as they continue the work of previous generations, and always they were always ready to prepare future generations to engage in the same type of sacrifice. So certainly, Anitna, certainly I've referenced it as an idiom of resilience. And I'm going to talk about some of the sort of the technologies of charisma and well-being that's also connected to the idea of Anitna. One sort of theoretical and conceptual and also psychological tensions that exist within the political prisoners themselves, within the activists, and that I've had to grapple is really how they produce power, how they produce agency, as they clearly do, how they create well-being in the aftermath of trauma and violence, and while being politically imprisoned, when they so aspire towards the doctrine of anatta. And this is true of all, I think, Theravadan and in Buddhist societies, how that this sort of the issue of political self-sacrifice and selflessness can come into tension with all these other acts of resistance. So this is something that I've had to grapple with in terms of the political prisoners engaging striving for this ideal of selflessness, but also needing to engage in self-protection, in self-care, self-creation, and also yearning for self-adulation, as you'll see that they do as political leaders. And so I referenced the term technologies of self, which was, of course, sort of referenced by Foucault, and he defined it as technologies of the self permit individuals to effect by their own means or with the help of others a certain number of operations on their own bodies and soul, thoughts, conducts, and ways of being so as to transform themselves in order to attain a certain state of happiness, purity, wisdom, perfection, or immortality. Really what I'm asking is really how these technologies of the self, technologies of well-being, technologies of charisma are crafted in the Burmese ontological, epistemological, cosmological, and political and historical context by these political prisoners. And in terms of these technologies for sustaining a nonviolent social movement, it certainly belonged to the realm of the political sacred. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean by that. But the material, aesthetic, relational, and emotional qualities of the democracy movement, and one of the main ways that they sustained it over time is that it really created this sense of nearness to the divine, both for the supporters and for the political prisoners themselves. And just for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to carve up some of the ethnographic material into sort of the public and the private, even though theoretically and symbolically those two things are mutually constitute one another. It's not an actual distinction that I make in my writings, but it just makes it easier for me to kind of present this material to you. But just know that the two kind of bleed into each other. One of the main settings that I've been conducting this work in terms of the more sort of public context in which they engage in these sort of technologies of well-being and resilience is the Burmese political festival, or the Nangye Pue. And the Nangye Pue is a subgenre of sort of the Burmese Pue, which is a very typical sort of manifestation in Burma. It's something that really occurs daily all across Burma. And like the Buddhist Pue, the Nangye Pue possesses distinct structured and unstructured elements. It has very specific type of sort of aesthetic, temporal, and experiential qualities. And it's also a place where very historically contingent epistemological and cosmological frameworks intersect with bodily discipline, internalized compartments, and rehearsed scripts. And it's also something that's transmitted across generations. Unlike the Buddhist Pue, the Nangye Pue has obviously a distinct political theme. Political oratory replaces the Buddhist sermon. Although the person who's chosen to engage in that political oratory has charismatic qualities that verge on the sacred. This, as I said, this entire, for the remainder of the talk, I'm going to be talking about this sort of diffuse space of the political sacred, where aspects of politics are understood partially through religious forms and modalities. And as we'll discuss, it also allows many non-Buddhists to participate in these gatherings. I have an article out in the journal Psychianthro already about the white shirts of the 88 generation. I'm not going to talk about this at length. This is certainly a main technology of well-being and charisma that they utilize. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the white shirts of the 88 generation in terms of the different layers of ontological, cosmological, and religious meaning that it has, as well as some of the political layers, the historical layers, and some of the implications for the public and the collective self, as well as the private and personal manifestations. Certainly the white shirts of the 88 generation are certainly connected to the tradition of sacred amulets and tattoos In Southeast Asia, this is a very well-developed literature, and bodily adornment. This type of tattooing, ceremonial garments, amulets or lepwe in Burma preceded the arrival of Theravada Buddhism into the region, and they across different contexts where these practices existed. They tended to provide physical safety and security to those who donned it or who had brandished the tattoo, and they also created a sense of spiritual potency, of charisma, something I can't go into it very much, but an indigenous term known as Oza. Certainly, there is also a layer of Buddhist meaning to it. Donning new robes of any color signal transition into new identities and social roles. Buddhist monastic robes themselves are thought to have magical qualities that would protect the wearer from witches, ghosts, and other malevolent spirits. Buddhist morality, known as lila, is imagined to be a protective cloak in which the monk is supposed to remain wrapped, a cloak of decorum. And then yet another layer of a more personal meaning for these activists. The prison uniforms between 1988 and 2007 were also white. So certainly the donning and the transition, once they got into the prison, that they were handed these prison uniforms, it signaled their entry into new forms of bodily subjugation, symbolic and actual nakedness, human misery, torture, and all manners of degradation. So this is one member of the 88 generation who actually spent 20 years of his life in prison. Pyeongchok was actually one of my first participants in my ethnography, my friend. And he actually, this is my part of a prison-centered interview that I did with him about the white shirt. And he says the white color signifies that the work I'm doing is noble and righteous. Other people with similar mindset also wear this color. And I stand by what I do. Our way of dress is a way of demonstrating that we accept it and that we are of one flesh. He's talking about with the others who don this white. This is how I feel about it. He says later on in the interview, this also means that we are obligated to follow an ethical code of conduct. So this is their law. So he really conveys this sense of being part of the same body, of one flesh. They not only wear it in their at these Nanyanye boys, which would occur several times a week, at least during the period of my field work. They would also do it when they were in actually danger, when they were protesting non-violently. And the new self that's constructed when donning these white shirt is really one where many vulnerable selves become fused into a stronger collective body. And it is in this way that they produce a sense of inviolability when engaging in these incredibly dangerous acts of protest. And during key moments when they don the white shirt, certainly in terms of sort of radiating charisma, this is certainly the moment where both symbolically and I think subjectively, their bodies are transformed from former political prisoners to the idealized form of the Yegang or the hero. And so the white shirt signified also for them the sense of righteousness, the sense of purity, and a life devoted to self-sacrifice. And they consciously and unconsciously emulated the Chakravarti, the universal ruler in Buddhism, in numerous other ways. So they had these sort of both conscious and unconscious strivings. And all of this, I think, contributed to a sense of well-being. This is also them. I mean, it wasn't just the donning of the white shirt, but really what I call these sort of kingly comportments, these bodily self-presentation of dignity. They had excellent posture, the 88 generation. I mean, it was really, really impressive. And all the more impressive, too, because one of the main ways that they would actually torture them in the prisons was they would have them obviously lower themselves and they would inflict violence on them. They would beat them. That was a typical way that they would punish them. So the idea that they would put on these white shirts in public in their ceremonial attire. It was both a reminder of their political imprisonment. It was the same color as their prison uniforms, but it was also something. It was also about the sense of dignity that they would display in front of the public. And this was certainly true of this guy. My friend, also part of the 88 generation, he was actually the only member of the 88 generation that was actually taken away when the 2021 coup occurred. In February, they came for him. They came to all their homes, but many of them had already left. So this is Gomiae, and he was taken away in the early morning hours. The first day of the coup, he went into prisons for 2 years. And Byron knows a little bit about what goes on in the prisons because he's read some of my work. He was asking me last night actually about what we know about the information that was coming out of the prison. This guy endured this for 2 years. And then there was an amnesty and they released him kind of inexplicably. And this is how he shows up. He's in this kind of pressed, immaculate white shirt. He gets out. I don't have the video footage to show, but I usually show it to my undergraduates when I'm teaching. He gets out of, there's this bus that comes out of insane prison and drops him off in the middle of an urban area. There's a swarm of reporters around him. He gets out and he's wearing this, he's perfectly groomed. He's wearing this immaculate white shirt. And he gets out and he puts his hand on his heart and he says, "I will always be with the people of Burma." And then he's taken away by his comrades. So, and I don't need to poke fun at Sean Turnell, but Sean Turnell, who's actually, and some of you may know him, he was actually Aung San Suu Kyi's economic advisor, a scholar from Australia. And he was also taken away in the early months of the coup in 2021. He also spent 2 years in insane prison where Gomiae was, not too far from him, I think. And this is how he looked when he came out of prison, right, after 2 years. And this is how we would all look if we came out after we come out of a Burmese prison. So you can't really underestimate the amount, the bodily discipline that goes into this. And this was true also of Aung San Suu Kyi. You know, I think a lot of those photos of her with her, you know, hair immaculately done with all the flowers. It's sort of these somewhat sort of fetishistic, but certainly orientalized representations of her. But what people don't know is that was also a form of resistance. But what both Gomiae, the 88 generation, and Aung San Suu Kyi was saying is, no matter what you do to me, you're not going to sully me. You're not sully my dignity. And this was an everyday form of resistance that they engage in. And they did it in numerous other ways. I had this whole thing where I analyzed some of their hand gestures, very similar to that of the universal ruler, the imperial gesture of the Chakravarti, is exactly what Gomiae did. By the way, Gomiae, and I'll get to talk about this just a little bit, in terms of the religious diversity that's in the democracy movement, he's a main leader in the 88 generation, a main charismatic figure. His family's actually Muslim, right? But he came out, and one of the main ways that the 88 generation speaks is with these gestures that are considered sort of the sort of the ultimate example of the universal ruler of this Sajaman. And it's with the hand on the heart, with the arms held out right. This is me. This is him, Gomiae, when he came out. You can see Mingonai, who's also Mingonai is probably the most well-known political prisoner next to Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma. And he's out of prison right now. And you see that his hand on his heart, the gesture with the hand, and this is one of the 88 generation members. I'm asking them during a person-centered interview about that gesture, and they say, if I had to talk about this in more abstract terms, the audience, the people are recognizing and understanding me, believing in the duty that I have towards them, and I'm demonstrating that I'm steadfastly bearing that duty. I accept this responsibility in a deferential and deep way. With the work that one has, the audience that you have, that they respect you and believe in your responsibility towards them, you are symbolizing that you are bearing that load. And I think I've covered this already. The Nanga these political festivals and these sort of public technologies of charisma and well-being that they constantly enact is something that's open to both Buddhists and non-Buddhists, because it is this sort of diffuse conceptual space. And the term one flesh, which my interlocutor references earlier, also signals the creation of new selves that transcend the current constructed barriers of religious identity in this instance. The Nanga created both sort of roles and selves that allow both Buddhists and non-Buddhists to be rendered pure and righteous, and to stand together as a collective body that signifies one flesh. So who is pure, who belongs to the movement, is not based on religion in this case, it's based on who sacrificed, right? And who's demonstrated the purity of their intent based on that sacrificial action. It doesn't matter if they're Buddhist or Muslim, and they're really standing side by side. And so, as I said, I'm going to carve up this ethnographic material into, what was these more public manifestations, right? And now I'm going to talk about technologies of self in private and more personal contexts. And this is my friend Senzal Tway. I showed a photo of him at the very beginning of the talk. Senzal Tway was a beloved figure in the democracy movement. He was arrested in 1999 as a university student, and then sentenced to 36 years in prison, released in 2012. I met him in 2013. He's a very well-known artist who had in prison exchanged his food ration so that he would get access to the prison garbage and a pair of scissors and glue, and he would create these really beautiful collages. A very well-known artist in Burma. So Senzal Tway was diagnosed with advanced liver cancer in November 2017. The cancer was most certainly a result of infections that he had acquired during his time in prison, and that went untreated. And so the political prisoner community, I heard about this in November of 2017. I remember it was a little bit before Thanksgiving, and this guy, one of Senzal Tway's best friends, Chit Manlay, called me and told me that he had been diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And so the dissident community immediately began trying to raise funds for him to be able to seek treatment. But his condition declined rapidly. And you'll see him here, he's already very jaundiced. There was really almost no treatments available in Burma. And I was being told just after receiving that initial news a little bit for Thanksgiving, that he just had a matter of days, weeks, if not days, to live. And I made preparations to return to Yangon because I had come back to be with my family for the holidays. And then all of a sudden, after hearing this horrendous news that Senzal Tway was about to pass away, this photo of him circulated in the media. And it was of him sitting upright in lotus position. And people were saying he was going to be okay. And this is my fieldwork notes from that time. And I was already making plans to fly back. And then my friends in the dissident community said, no, you might not need to fly back. And if you fly, you might have to meet us in Bangkok, where he's going to definitely go seek treatment. So this is something that I realized. I was surprised and taken aback when Chit said that they were about to take him to Thailand. And a little hurt when I heard that Senzal Tway said he would not be there when I arrived. They said, well, he won't be, you can come, but he won't be here because he's going to be in Thailand. He's going to be receiving treatment. And I had a skeptical and confused reaction. The situation became clear as I messaged back and forth with Polly, but I still had not fully processed it as I went to bed. But after I went back to sleep and then woke up the next morning, I had pure joy in my heart because of what I had heard. I'm sorry. And this is a continuation of my field notes. And I wrote, this is who Senzal Tway is, down to the bone. He displayed it even as he was about to meet what I knew in my own heart with certain depth. He has literally risen up, as he had always done, as he knew how to do. And I understood more how hope could be infectious and how this community has sustained themselves for so long. I apologize. And I imagine that there have been many moments like this in the past. One person's courage, hope, fire, resilience, spark compassion in the face of circumstances that would make almost anyone else despair, brought awe, a warm feeling in the chest, along with the joy, hope, courage, belief. Previously, before I would think these really depressing thoughts about the deep sadness had already transitioned into mourning him, feeling an immeasurable guilt. I felt this new joy. I could not help but smile to myself, thinking about how alive, dignified, and resolute Sensotwe looked once that house stayed with posture when the photo section had taken. I felt so happy to know that someone like him or that community existed. And he remained, he did go to Bangkok to receive treatment, and he remained, you can see him right after he had come out of surgery. He was in full lotus position. And he remained dignified and calm throughout it. They were able to alleviate some of his symptoms, like the jaundice in Thailand. And then I flew to Thailand. I had actually flown to Burma and heard that he left. So I just got to the airport in Yangon and flew immediately out to Bangkok. And I was with him the entire time when he was receiving his cancer treatment in Thailand. They sent him home. We flew back, and we lost him. I ended up flying back to spend Christmas and New Year's with my family. I thought he would still be there when I returned after New Year's, and he passed away. But you see, even in these very private, the most private of moments, they maintain this sense of dignity. They employ what we would call these sort of technologies of self in their life. I also have another memory of Sun Twe during this time. There's actually a film about him, for those of you are interested. But the person who had created the film, a filmmaker from the West, was there showing him the final cut of the film. And in the film, it's not just about Sun Twe, it's about other political prisoners as well, but there's one reenactment where he's like he's reenacting being inside prison. And they're showing the photos of it. I remember coming to his sister's home where he was staying, and there was maybe like 12 of him and his friends and family watching on like a little laptop like this. The filmmaker was there watching the final cut of it and seeing those scenes where he was in prison. And I remember his sister and his very close a friend at the time, a love interest of sorts, they were crying. They were crying to see his suffering, even though it was just a depiction of his suffering. And I remember he sat in lotus position and he was comforting them. He was completely calm, completely gentle, and he was comforting the other people who were suffering based on witnessing his own suffering. So what I want to end with, and I know it's getting, I don't know how much more time I have, but I really want to at least talk a little bit about the emotions, the subjectivity of the supporters, and these really, and the type of sublime emotions like awe that's engendered by these extraordinary acts of bodily self-sacrifice from these non-violent political activists in Burma. And there was a point in my research where I transitioned into also interviewing these supporters. The first couple of years was spent mostly interviewing the political prisoners and their families and the activists, but I began also interviewing those who would support them. And those who would support them came in many forms. Sometimes they were individuals who were actual fictive or actual kin who actually devoted their lives to helping them. And sometimes they were individuals who showed up occasionally and helped them when they could. And when I would ask them about individuals like Aung San Suu Kyi or Min Aung Hlaing or San Suu Kyi, they would often describe this heaviness of heart, right? When they would contemplate the suffering of these political prisoners, they would relate the tale of their sacrifices with quivering voices, with tears in their eyes. And there was this intermingling of emotions like awe with compassion. And this is also very much in keeping with sort of the Buddhist landscape that we've been dealing with. And also in terms of the yearning being drawn kind of in a bodily way to these figures in the democracy movement, right? The sort of the support that they would be able to draw in through these acts of sacrifice, very similar to the sort of pilgrimages, for example, that many Buddhists make to be close to the relics of the Buddha's historical body. And in terms of the supporters and their sense of connection to these martyrs in the democracy movement. As I mentioned briefly, this was a period prior to the transition in around 2010, 2012, where individuals couldn't even have pictures of their family members who had been arrested. Upon pain of arrest, they couldn't have a picture of Aung San Suu Kyi or Min Aung Hlaing upon pain of being interrogated. And so they had to find other ways to connect with them. And this is my interviewing a volunteer at the local National League for Democracy movement. So she herself is not an activist, she's simply someone who shows up occasionally and supports the movement. And she's talking about what happened in 1988. She said there was a prayer event for Mother Sue. She's talking about Aung San Suu Kyi. I didn't know about it, that I would also have to pray at the pagoda. So they were holding a sort of a ritual collective prayer as a form of protest at the pagoda. She either didn't dare go there or she couldn't go there. And she says, so from here, she's talking about I'm interviewing her in her home. From here, I was like, Min Aung Hlaing, I will just pray for him in whatever way I could, because I'm a Buddhist. If my prayer came true, they would be released. And then you have this kind of there are ways to understand this conceptually in the Buddhist realm in terms of suit down or making these wishes, these prayers for others, and then both the sacrifices of the democracy activists impacting the merit of those who they sacrifice for, as well as the prayers that their supporters engage in. And then she says, when I thought about it, I wondered if I could do as much as they did. They became my leader, my objects of worship. They were like our savior who would liberate us. I assumed that belief. That was why, even though they got in prison, I always prayed for them in my mind. There were things like that. And at that time, I didn't dare to do things like protesting and so on. So there's a period of time. It was much too dangerous to go onto the streets and protest. Very few people, only the most courageous, dared to do that. And it was illegal to even own a photograph of some of these dissidents. That was the extent to which this was silenced. And yet you had individuals like this who would, in their private prayers, in their rituals inside their homes, at their altars that they would engage in every day, they would pray for Min Aung Hlaing or Aung San Suu Kyi or San Suu Kyi. And this is something that they would talk about in fairly hushed tones. I had to get to know her a while before she confided all this in me. And this sort of daily rituals that she was engaged in certainly reaffirmed her commitment to these leaders. And she had the sense that her prayers could help them in the same manner that their sacrifices helped save her. So it was this sort of interactive relationship that she had with them. And through these prayers that she would engage in multiple times a day, these political leaders came to possess an everyday familiarity for her, and the relationship she had with them was deeply personal to her. I don't think she'd ever met Min Aung Hlaing before, as far as I know. And it also came to constitute a relationship with the divine. I don't know if I included this quote in here, but I have quotations of her and other supporters talking about Aung San Suu Kyi as referencing her as the Pandishin, which is the creator. And this is in a Buddhist context, and so you see all the synchronism at play, right? There's no creator in Buddhism, right? But that's how she references her. And it was certainly how, these are these technologies of intersubjectivity that had emerged because of the specific historical context and fact of political imprisonment. And she had this deep sense of intimacy with them, of really knowing them. So just circling back to the questions that I posed at the very beginning, how are technologies of the self crafted in the context of the Burmese democracy movement? Certainly, the core narrative of the social movement community and the democracy movement and their supporters is one where selflessness and sacrificial action are set up as a primary goal. It's valorized. There's a motivation for it. It's set up as an aspiration. But around this core, we can also think of these sort of concentric circles of multiple narratives where the self is valorized as heroic. It's considered to have sacred qualities. It's potentially infused with power, is worthy of protection, and is worthy also of adulation. And also going back to this question that I started my research with, is really how do social movements remain resilient? Certainly to the sedimentation of charisma in material objects and bodily adornment, through sources of well-being, including enactments of mundane practices around dress, comportment, affect, and other everyday and ritual practices that enables forms of what I reference as self-making and rules-making, and through mechanisms for building and creating intersubjectivity between these charismatic leaders, these political prisoners and their supporters, even in their absence. And this is Minko 9. He sent me a photo of him with his cats. I didn't have time to go into some of the sort of the many ways that they're also able to realize a very compassionate masculinity, these nonviolent activists. But he's a very charismatic, powerful figure in the Burmese democracy movement who's making a lot of decisions, who is a prime focus of the military for that reason. And you don't think, if you see a lot of, unfortunately I didn't bring the slides, but if you see a lot of the inhabitants of masculinity now, it's mostly soldiers and guns. So they're coming to our way of, in terms of these types of manifestations are coming to our way of thinking. But this was and is the sort of the manifestations of sort of masculinity within the context of a nonviolent movement for democracy, where sacrifice is valorized.
Well, thank you very much for that really terrific presentation. I've read, as you know, some earlier drafts of this material. I'm impressed by how it's developed, but I'm also impressed by how actually bringing the visual qualities of seeing this together with the text, something that of course we'll be talking about later tonight also, about how the visual and the textual work side by side in a very powerful way to make us understand more deeply, what it's difficult to present to our mind purely in the textual. So it's really wonderful to see this, and very moving. And the other thing that I just think about is a number of us in this room were very close friends of Stanley Tambiah. And so much of what you talk about here feels like I wish I could turn to Tambiah and say, Tambiah, comment on this because his work is so closely related to these notions of that work in Highland, to talk about the kingship, to talk about the ambulance to talk about the sources of power, etc. Well, so quite wonderful. Mary Jo.
I have a mundane question. Who provides those beautifully starched shirts? Who is providing the pen that goes in the pocket? Who is doing that work, and how do they play into this presentation, extraordinary presentation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very profound question, and something that I didn't get to touch upon. But you know, there's, I mean, they're embedded in these communities and in these families, and these supporters and other dissidents. So, for example, so to answer your question, so when I traveled, one of the my first experiences conducting field work with the 88 generation was not in Burma, but was in the United States. After I had met them in Burma, and after I just filed my dissertation actually at UCLA, and that's significant too, because I wouldn't be able to do this if I had not filed my dissertation yet. But the leaders of some of the leaders of the 88 generation, Pyeongcho, Ambudjo, others, said we're going to be in the United States for a month. We're going to tour, you know, the diaspora community and hold all these community meetings. And I ended up flying out to San Francisco to meet them, and ended up joining them. I didn't anticipate that when I went out there, but joined them for a period of a month, where we went from like town to town to like Buffalo, or DC, all these places where there's large communities of Burmese dissidents. And they had two shirts. As I saw, I have ethnographic information. They had two shirts. And I remember, you know, the other, and they had they came like monks. I mean, they had like nothing. They had like no cash, no credit cards, no personal checks. You know, the people would just meet them at their airport, and they would go stay at someone's home. They didn't necessarily even always know whose home, or had never met that person. But they were like monks. Monks also, they're one Buddhist monks, also cannot carry money. And then there are other people in Burmese, they're called Tambiah, who take care of these individuals. So they have many such people. And I saw, you know, sometimes they would do it themselves, but often there were individuals, these other dissidents who were not the main charismatic figures. They may have also been former political prisoners themselves. Sometimes they were just supporters, like myself. I also came to be regarded as a supporter who would do these activities for them. And
So iron them,
wash them,
press them.
Yeah, but in the prisons, I understand that they would keep like a shirt, like in a little plastic bag, in anticipation of being released. And then that was a common practice. Or they would, I imagine they would be prison visits every 2 weeks. They would have someone drop off something, maybe if they have anticipating they might be released. But so it's a really good question. But they had there was a lot of labor and a lot of emotion and sentiment that went into it. And there were, they didn't they didn't have jobs in the way that we would understand it. Those people who had to get jobs actually had to drop out of the movement, right? Because they couldn't participate in all these things. But usually there would be, like Sanzatwe, for example, his sister took care of him. And she was there then, and she was there the entire time, and through his cancer as well. And she would do it's usually the person who also would do this very difficult journey to the prisons to make the prison visits, to bring them supplies. Those are also the political prisoners who would survive, or who had loved ones who loved them and would bring them these supplies. I think it's okay that I share this. I think it's important. I think she'll be okay with it. But I know that his sister actually talked about how she had actually, in one of the prison visits, in this very remote prison that she would have to go to bring in the supplies, she had actually had a miscarriage as well. And I recall in the hospital, sometimes her soothing him in very specific ways that felt almost like he was an infant. Right. So there's a lot of things that.
I think of the people praying who couldn't have the photograph
Mhm.
of their loved one, were they also acting out the prayer for doing the laundry and the white shirts and things of that sort?
So also a very profound question. One of the something that I was going to share with you, but that I didn't have time to share was this is actually the parents of one of my first ethnographic participants, and my friend Pyeongcho from the ABA generation is one of the main leaders, along with Mingo Now and Go Jimmy and others. And there were actually, I don't know if I have a photo of it, right, to get it out. That's Pyeongcho. That's Pyeongcho. And who was like, he eventually joined Aung San Suu Kyi in parliament. He had been in prison for 20 years. He was a member of the 80th generation, good friends with Jimmy and Yae and Minko Nine. And then this was his younger brother, who was also martyred in the movement. He died in Mandalay prison, and died largely from untreated sort of medical conditions from the torture during the interrogation. So if you look at this photo right here to the right is where they have the photo of him. And then we will go over to this house, and the father was the one who didn't miss a single prison visit for his two sons, both of whom were in jail, often very far away from each other in these remote prisons. He went every 2 weeks, brought all the supplies to them to help them. He did not miss a single visit in 20 years for both his sons. But the mother only went maybe once a year. And they really, there was some sense that they wanted to protect her from that. So she made the initial visit when Pyeongcho, for example, was first arrested, but thereafter she didn't go. Maybe like once or twice a year she would go. And they really wanted to protect her from that. And most of my ethnography was about, this martyr in the beginning, and this person who was like the hero, the person who was actually participating, the leader, the person who was participating in this community. But anytime I would visit them in his parents' home, I would sit and talk to the mother. I would hold hands with her like I do now, sit and have tea with her. And she would tell me about how she prayed for her two sons. And that was partly how I began being very interested in what she was doing. But it took a while. It took a couple of years.
So thank you very much for your talk. Before I ask the question I have, I just want to acknowledge some discomfort I have of asking a question in the face of what you've just shown us. That strikes me as something perhaps perverse to ask an academic question instead of just witnessing what. But I do have a question, and it's one that maybe I'm imagining it would make something of a difference between someone who's doing psychological anthropology and someone who's doing cultural anthropology. So it's kind of on the sides of things that you showed. But I wonder, is there something about we humans that when we see an innocent person being brutalized and enduring it with dignity, that it does something to us? It's transformative of us. The reason I'm asking that is that we see this cross-culturally. The imagery of, within Christianity, the suffering servant, and that by his stripes we are healed. But he was innocent, guilty of no crime, but endured what was done to him without saying a word. We see it in the civil rights movement and the Gandhian Quit India, that expectation that to endure horrible injustice with dignity does something to the people who witness it in a way that none of the people that you spoke about were leaders of militias in Burma, who have also probably been brutalized. Didn't have the same trans. So that's on the side of, is there something about we humans that when we witness these atrocities, it elicits something that is positive in us? The other side is just Buddhist cultural. The image you showed of the monkey who sacrifices his body for the sake of others, I'm aware of is that stories of like that are often used intersubjectively. That someone would say, if he could endure that for the sake in order to become a Buddha for me, then surely I can endure this little bit that is happening to me. So the question that I have is that what you're showing us, trying to explore, help us to understand, seems to stretch to two sides. One that is, we humans have this reaction. And then the other, we humans who are Buddhists have a particular reaction. And it doesn't seem that just thinking about it as Buddhists is sufficient, because what you're describing didn't happen in Cambodia, where you have Buddhists with similar atrocities. So that explaining what's happening just by reference to there's some deep cultural structure values that comes with Buddhism, then I have a problem. Why is it different in Cambodia than in Burma?
So also a profound question and an important question, and something that I've grappled with. You know, I think it's both. You know, I'm reluctant to say we humans, but okay, we humans. I think there is something about that coalesce around sacrificial action in this context, the notion of living in this local context, that has these qualities. And I teach a course on political activism at UCLA, and I go through the civil rights movement, and I draw analogies, and even with some of the, you know, even with the Northern Irish in terms of they had more armed struggle, but there was certainly these sort of some of, I would say, some of the sense of righteousness that came with some of that. You know, they're feeling like they were also sacrificing when they went into the prisons, or when they were engaging in the hunger strikes. There is something about that. I think there is. So when I realized that I was interested in sacrifice and sacrificial action, I was reading Freud and like René Girard. And so, yes, you can, I think there are certain qualities that coalesce around the sacrifice and these sort of sublime emotions. Certainly the literature on awe would speak to that as well. It's this sort of extreme virtue, not just innocence, but really responding with dignity, as you say, but also this nonviolence, this compassion towards someone who's going to direct hate at you. I think that is certainly something that you can do many cross-cultural comparisons for, that you can talk in terms of we humans have to have this reaction. But there were things that were specific. I could only go so far with the ideas about sacrifice, as Freud discussed, for example, because it was a Judeo-Christian context, and it didn't really quite apply to the Buddhist context. And it was only when I really delved into the Buddhist mythology and literature that I really began to understand what was happening with the Burmese specifically. And so I think there's, it's both, and there were limitations. So, for example, one big difference with some of the sacrifice literature, we'll keep going with the example of Freud, is one of the main the main exemplars of sacrifice in Theravada Buddhism is the sacrifice of the mother, of the maternal figure. And when a Buddha or a Bodhisattva is engaging in these sort of this sort of bodily sacrifice, the most exalted form of sacrifice, it's said to be as pure as the compassion and selflessness that a mother has for her children, typically son. In the local Burmese context, this is the mother and the son, right? And so the analogy, how they understand the sacrifice is in terms of the mother. And of course, in Christianity, it's all about the father, right? And sacrifice in relation to those ideas. So that's where, so it's both. and I hope that addresses.
I could just add, maybe what I'm most perplexed about is not the motivations of the people who do this, but what happens to the people who witness it even at a distance, like in the zoo. And so how we have a feeling what is happening there is so wrong. And I don't think that if you've said it's part of Buddhist culture that this is just routine, it should happen, I would say that's still wrong. So that feeling that this is so wrong, that this should be stopped, but that it's part of what you were referring to, or this intersubjectivity, that there's an intersubjectivity, whatever their motives are. And I witness what is happening to them. I just feel this is so wrong. And so I'm just trying to figure out, what is part of what you were showing.
And what you're suggesting, of course, is that there is something sort of at the surface level that we react to, but that also, by going deeply into its religious and cultural context, at another level, we still react to it, but at a sort of different level as well.
I would agree with that, except I might change the adjectives deeper. This is so wrong, I might say that's the deeper. Right? All right, so.
Let's get a couple of, we'll go back around the table. I know there's a couple of people on the Zoom who are attending who will have Jorge, and I want to just thank Jorge for supporting this whole event also. Jorge Espada, who is the head, really the coordinator of the entire Southeast Asia program here, but to read so that we engage also the people who are not in the room.
Thank you. So there are two questions. I'll read them both together and you can answer them. The first one is, are there any aspects of your work that discuss how these technologies of charisma are gendered? The second question, I'm sure you're aware of Matida's memoir of her time in prison. She makes much of her meditation practice and its role in her maintaining her well-being. Did your informants talk about such practices as well?
Yeah, so in terms of sort of the gendered aspects, I already touched upon it a bit already, that's certainly a main aspect of it. Is this idea of maternal sacrifice that's very prevalent in the Buddhist context. And that really, so for example, they reference Aung San Suu Kyi as Mother Sue. And it's very much, this understanding of her as having engaged, and that same participant that I remember in the interview that I had with her, she talked about how that's how much she sacrificed her children. She left them in England. That's how much she loves us. And that's something that really impacts it. The Aung San Suu Kyi and the NLD's electoral potency is something that they won 3 elections. One in 1990, one in 2015, one in 2020, and that one in 2020 spurred this 2021 coup, which transitioned the entire country once again, and it transitioned actually into armed struggle after that. And so there's those types of gendered aspects of self-sacrifice, but there's also an aspect of self-sacrifice in the democracy movement where it was something that was also very much open to the women in a way that armed struggle probably is not, where they could engage in it as eagerly and as steadfastly as the men did. And also, just like Aung San Suu Kyi, that they could sort of exert their charismatic appeal and power based on this sacrificial action as much as the men could. And in a lot of ways, the women, like Matida, for example, so that's a good connection to the second question. that a lot of the women in the democracy movement who were leaders or who were charismatic figures usually were able to exert that charismatic authority like Aung San Suu Kyi did as just sort of individuals. The men, like the 88 generation, usually had to band together with other men. And that's interesting. And so yes, there were gendered aspects of it, and I've written a little bit about it. In terms of meditation, I did, yes, almost everyone I interviewed when they're in prison for like 20 years, I'll say they meditated and they did it. And there was already some literature on it. Gustav Hartmann is actually someone who's written about it academically at length about Vipassana meditation practices in the prisons, and that was already something that was very much that had been in a scholarly way, and also in these memoirs sort of documented quite extensively. So I didn't focus on it quite as much, and it's also the case in Buddhist studies that there is this sort of verification of these sort of things that I would describe as more sort of about the mind and, about these sort of lofty aspects of Buddhism and things like ritual and everyday practice, praying at your altar and things of that nature are not really, as examined as much or as seen as mattering as much. So it's very important for me to focus on the other sort of ritual and everyday practices around Buddhism.
Jorge, I assume that although we said 45:30, we can carry on here for
Yeah, we have the
as long as we,
right, and
and
the
as
food
long
for
as
the
we
other.
assume we aren't gonna get kicked out.
We're not.
Okay. Yes, introduce yourself to us.
Yes, my name is Byron. I'm a faculty member. I'm Charlie's colleague, and I'm an anthropologist as well. Thank you, Seinenu. It was very nice to hear the longer version of the talk. I heard a shorter version in Palermo, in Italy back in the summer. So my question is like where you left off on the last slide, which is I'm sure I mispronounced the name, Monkey Nine.
Yeah.
You said that he takes a lot of decisions for the movement, right? So my question follows from that, which is there a model of leadership which is unique that comes out of this idea of charisma? And how does one convert the kind of potency that these people have into leveraging power and influence over people?
Yeah, so he's I don't think there's enough written about Mingona. There needs to be a lot more done on him. He is fascinating. He is really fascinating. And right now, after the 2021 coup, so in the 88 generation, there was a handful of main leaders. I shared information with Gojini Yongye, for example. So Mako 9 really transitioned into advising the National Unity Government, which is the shadow government that is now waging armed struggle against the junta. But he is his own thing. I mean, he is separate from any structured bureaucratic structures of the government. He certainly goes back and forth with them and advises them. He sends out his thoughts either in the form of poetry or just sort of these charismatic political oratory, but now like uploaded onto YouTube or Facebook kind of thing. And he remains he stays away from anything that pertains to sort of worldly or financial, anything, right? He lives this very sort of basic existence, almost like a monk. And he also will not leave the country. So it's very, I've been starting to think a little bit more about sort of displacement and emplacement in relation to the Burmese and democracy movement at all. So he's very much about emplacement and staying inside the country. And he's probably one of the most powerful, if you want to use that term, leaders in this new landscape of resistance. The most influential, certainly. If you go on a social media page, I think he has something like 2 million followers or something. That's very small. I don't think everyone in Burma signs up for Facebook or whatever it is, but it gives you a sense of his reach. So yeah, I mean, it's something that really needs to be examined, that I've been meaning to write about more extensively. But there's something about the sacrifice, the nonviolence, and he once again he's somewhere. We don't know exactly where inside the country where he continues to be in bodily harm. It's no longer a nonviolent struggle. It's now armed struggle. It's civil war and revolution. He's not armed, and the people around him are not armed either. He's just and he's living this very impoverished life. It's fascinating, but he wields this tremendous power and this tremendous influence, just completely different from the models we have of a political leader, right? So it's fascinating, and they haven't really. I think the NUG, the National Unity Government, which is the shadow government, and this new landscape of resistance, that all the different actors in it. Because I don't think when someone takes up armed, it really inspires the same type of devotion and the same type of they don't really radiate the same type of charismatic appeal. They still very much rely on him to play that role of the sacrificial figure. And he's taken that on. So I don't know if that answers. Yeah. Yeah.
We'll have lots of different questions, some of which have already been raised. In regard to your question, I would ask, aren't we all inhuman? And I'm really, so that got triggered. Mary Jo picked up a different aspect of it. But I was impressed by your saying that you get off a prison bus and you're in a starched white shirt. So my question always there is, why does the state allow that? And that leads to a set of questions. And I want to ask a broader question, which is how you do. I know you teach a class in imprisonment in lots of places. So I'm wondering about how you negotiate the comparative aspects. In the Iranian literature, one of the most fascinating things for me, scary things for me, is the negotiations between the jailers and the prisoners, which often uses a highly familial language, very much psychologically calibrated. And there are lots of exclusions, like not having photographs. Or in Singapore, when LKY cracked down on the political democracy movement, people were afraid to have pictures. Some of them got hidden, most of them got burned, right? So that's one question about the relations between the military and the people that they're imprisoning and whatnot. I have another question, which is about images, because I was paying attention to images too, and how you selected certain ones. So there's an image of an exposed brain with a scalpel or something split in half, and the other side is a mechanical brain. So I wonder who did that. Is that one of the artists? Because as you know, I've told you, I know a few of the 88 generation who were artists and who continued on, got let out at a certain point and established galleries and shows and so on. I don't know what's happened to them now. A second image that I was interested in was the image of the Buddha with, I think, a tear coming out. So I wonder how that plays in as well.
Yeah, fascinating questions. I teach a class on political imprisonment, very familiar with the political imprisonment in Iran and the literature on it. In terms of the comparisons, when you're so intimately familiar with the narratives and the history of political imprisonment and these dissidents and what they went through, I would say for the first 3-4 weeks of my class, for example, I teach the democracy movement, and then I slowly start pulling in
Iran, in the Northern Irish, and Guantanamo, and Abu Ghraib. And there are aspects of political imprisonment where you can begin to think of talking about us humans or how how inhumane or unhuman we are in terms of some of our practices in terms of torture. But there are a lot of similarities. So I have I don't know if you've heard of Sahar Dilajani, but she was a woman that was born in Evin prison in Tehran. She has a novel about it. It's about her family. It's a work of historical fiction, but based on her family's experiences. And I have Sahar visit my class every time I teach it, usually through Zoom. But some of her accounts of being the child, her parents were political prisoners, the child of a political prisoner, some of the ways that the dissident community in Iran and the political prisoners inside the prisons related to one another, very similar to the Burmese. There's so many similarities, and you can make hypothesize as to why that might be the case, the material conditions and the relational circumstances in terms of power and what have you. There are a lot of the relationship between the guards and the prison authorities and the political prisoners in Burma were really fascinating. In terms of the 88 generation and a lot of the folks that I work with, they were often able to kind of assert their charm and their charismatic authority inside the prisons as well. And so many of the individuals, even those who worked in the prisons, I think in their hearts were probably kind of against the junta or saw certain sort of practices. Or felt ambivalent about what they were doing and their part in it. And so they were often able to persuade a lot of these individuals to help them in different ways, to the extent that there would be pretty reliable information coming out of the prisons. In the 1990s and up until now, because of these networks that were formed, sometimes someone would be interrogated and tortured and would reveal information about a certain dissident, and they could get word out to that dissident who was not in prison that they were in danger, so that they could flee. I mean, it became a fairly the flows of information coming out of the prisons for that reason, was quite helpful to the movement in those ways, and they were able to sort of craft and structure their relationships that way. The most famous story about sort of this sort of charismatic sort of persuasion that they would engage in prison is Go Jimmy, who actually met his wife in prison, Nila Dane, who was also, and this is a story that all Burmese know about. And I think there was an NPR piece on them as well. I'll just go back to the image of Go Jimmy. He's a gentleman right there. He met his wife, Nila Dane, in prison. He had seen her when he was initially making, engaging in sort of charismatic political oratory before he was arrested. He was imprisoned and insane for a few years. Later on, she also came into the prison. She realized he was there. He remembered her. And he convinced the prison guards to let him visit the women's side of the prison, where they developed this romance with each other and were able to also exchange letters with each other. And once they were released from prison, they got married and they had a daughter. So that's one of the most kind of, this is a story that every Burmese know about in terms of sort of prison love stories. In terms of the images, there are a number of wonderful images that I could have used from this very creative community that I work with. Many of the individuals, like Pyeongcho, for example, was even kind of initially selected and drawn into the movement because they were artists. And back then there was no like AI to produce a lot of these images, right? And so they relied on those people who had beautiful handwriting or who could draw these beautiful flyers or these banners. But the particular ones that you point out, though, they were just like stock images that I pulled in. That it's interesting that you noticed them. So there can be a entire sort of analysis of my own choice of what stock images I pulled into my slide.
When you were talking, Charlie, about there being something human about responding to what appeared, to obvious violence against innocence, etc. The other thing that was running through my mind about what it means to be human was you must have also been impressed by the level of violence against these prisoners that you heard. You haven't really focused on in detail here, as at least one of your chapters sort of reminded me certainly of my time, of our time, Mary Jo, in Aceh, and listening to stories of torture and coming to really think and really to then begin to go through the mental process of how people who were not torturers became torturers. How that's cultivated. Rob, of course, knows a lot about this as well, but what it takes to turn someone into a torturer, but there is something that is present, very human, in that level of being able to be violent, etc., that you must have also been struck by at various times as you were curious to hear about what that was like for you, so that what it means to be human certainly is that component also that feels very real when you hear these stories.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And and it's not anything that I've really been able to reconcile with those other aspects, right?
Right.
And you just try and focus on those other aspects. Because I didn't, many people, I think when they do this type of work, also interview the perpetrators, where they spend time with them. I know some of there was some folks, especially European scholars, who came in and was doing work in the Burmese prisons, and they would also, interview the prison guards and really get to know that environment. I never, for the type of field work and for my temperament and the type of relationships I have with my friends, my interlocutors, my ethnographic participants, I never felt comfortable doing that because I felt like it would have been a betrayal. And I think they would have considered it a betrayal as well. And even within the movement, even within the 88 generation, when I first started interviewing Chocho, for example, I really stuck to him and his family and his network that was around him, because each one of these figures are sort of, they're quite all friends, and they all cooperate when they see each other constantly, but they're also these tiny charismatic centers. And I never wanted, I didn't want to give the sense that I was just, wanting to hang out with whomever, and wanting to, I felt like it would really impact my relationship with him and his family. I really wanted to and I think that was a correct intuition. And so that's how I engage and I feel for, let alone go to the perpetrators and start interviewing them.
And in some ways, I wasn't even thinking, there are people who do that.
Yeah.
I agree, and that has its own dynamics of what the nature of the subject is. But just hearing the stories is enough to also be deeply affecting them. And then to see how, in the survivance, if you will, as people talk about American Indian studies these days, and the ennoblement of, the quality of transcending suffering is just quite remarkable. But still, there is underlying this.
Yeah. And also, at least with this community, there are also ruptures and violations that some of the community members committed against one another. And that was the most painful for them to talk about. And they often never wanted to talk about it. In terms of that which is uplifting and ennobling was probably a story that Sansatre told me, that he went in as a very young man into prison. And there was this older political prisoner and some of his friends who targeted him
who harassed him, who regularly conspired with the guards to assault him. And did that for a very long period of time. And he couldn't do anything about it. He then requested that he be moved to a section of the prison where they kept a lot of the prisoners with various types of sort of skin infections, like leprosy or scabies, who were HIV positive. He said he preferred to stay with them. It was so horrendous what he was put through by this other person who was a political prisoner. And he said as soon as he was released, one of the first things, one of his first projects of activism that he did was to advocate for that person's release, to liberate that person. So that's a moment you have where yes, there's these, just these horrific, dark things. But then you have this person this wonderful person who had really the capacity to transcend and to be compassionate towards his perpetrator.
Any other questions? First of all, Jorge, online?
There's one more. Thank you for your presentation. There was a picture of a person with chains on his back. Was the chain from prison? Could you elaborate on the self-sacrifice, even though the chains were put on the back of the person in prison?
Yeah, so I believe that those particular images are really fascinating as well. They were reenactments by the political prisoner community. I think specifically the Assistant Association for Political Prisoner reenacted that. So I don't believe that was something that was actually told or taken. And there's almost like nothing like that available just because of the secrecy that surrounded the interrogations and the torture. But they would regularly enact it, and when we would have the the memorializations and the ceremonies at Nangere, they would have mock prisons. They would have many such reenactments and sort of cultural and intellectual sort of productions.
Yes.
Oh, yeah, I was going to ask, maybe it's a wrong question, but so interesting. So when you did the interview, did you go to the prison or they were already released?
So this was in the aftermath between 2012 and the 2021 coup. So the community that I work with was free and free enough also to be able to hang out with me and not be too much of a danger for me or for them.
I'm sorry that you guys who were in our class, you couldn't be here from the beginning. We understand why. But also to hear the quality of, and as you see, like in this picture, the quality of her ethnography, if you will, the deep engagement. It suggests no, ethnography does not have to be neutral. Yes. It can be deeply engaged. You have another question?
Oh, yes. So my another question is, this is the only, do you know any other ethnographers that they did the same topic like you did?
Yeah, many, specifically on this community or just political imprisonment. There's many. My favorite certainly is the Golden Arab Saga, and I draw a lot of her work on the Northern Irish.
Is this all? My question is: this work impact in a positive way in this type of activism in Burma or any other countries? Because this is similar. There is other country has the same innocent prisoner still and not released. But my question is like, is this type of work that you did and the other ethnographer did, is this impacting in the world in positive way to change something?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. Many of the individuals from this community, unfortunately, they were free between 2013 and 2021. There was a military coup in Burma in February of 2021, and many of them are now back in prison or displaced. They're stateless. They've migrated out of Burma. They're refugees, and some of them have been executed as well. I talked about that a little bit as well earlier. And the number of prisoners, political prisoners, I think it's a very low estimate, at least according to the Assistant Association for Political Prisoners. The last time I checked was over 20,000 in the Burmese prisons. And so in that way, I haven't been able to be impactful in that way. But in terms of just the broader question of sort of this sort of reflexive engagement with what I've been doing and whether or not it's been positively impacting the community, I like to think so.
Yeah.
And sometimes they give me affirmations in that way. I don't know if they're just being kind to me, but even I think I noticed that so we had that seminar. I think it was something we did through Zoom, through the Friday morning seminar. It was specifically about silences in the democracy movement. And they had never really evoked silence in the movement before. And early on in the coup, actually, it was very much about sound, like burning pots and pans, which they've also used some other types of resistance, even like in Scandinavia and whatnot. But thereafter, and they saw that, they interacted with our seminar, they started having these silent strikes. And that was also something, and I don't know if it was directly linked, but certainly there was a lot of talk in the community about silences and with silence, and they started doing these silent strikes, which still go on every now and then. And it's basically, it's ingenious because they don't have anyone come out at all, and the streets of Yangon or Mandalay are just completely empty. All the shops are closed. Everyone goes on strike. Everyone just stays indoors, and it is very powerful. Very powerful. And it bothered the junta so much that actually the first couple times that it happened, they said they were going to kill anyone who was silent. Which is absurd, right? And it's also, there's this absurdity to the junta's reacting to these things. So I don't know if that helps or answers your question.
And I have last question.
Yeah.
So when you move the slides, I just so father and daughter who buried the dead bodies in the Burma. I heard about this story, but I don't know what happened to them after they released or.
Yeah, I don't know which activists.
Your father and daughter. They opened a non-profit organization. They buried the dead bodies in Burma, and they.
It could.
I think and
your question. Brings a lot of different things to mind. I know that some of the dissidents that I had worked with who were helped organize parts of the Saffron Revolution. I know that during Cyclone Nargis, some of those individuals, so that was Pyo Aung and some of her, also another very young woman who was a charismatic leader. She and her other dissident friends, and they were actually the children of individuals who had gone to prison, who were political prisoners in 1988. 2007 was sort of one of the younger generations at the time, that came up at the time. I know that they had evaded arrest for the most part after the Saffron Revolution, and then they went to the Irrawaddy Delta to bury these dead bodies that were washing up after Cyclone Nargis. And then that's when they were finally arrested. There are other things that come to mind too, but I don't know if that was specifically
So I
dissident period you're talking about.
I think we're going to call this to a close now and say a very deep thank you. I think, the way you began by saying there are all of these that very often these things are looked at in terms of human rights, in terms of this, in terms of that. But if one goes inside the movements, you get a very different feel for it. And this notion really of the political sacred and how the political and the sacred interact in that kind of a setting, I think was really wonderful and insightful.